I boarded the late-night subway train after a long day at work, feeling exhausted and eager to get home. The train was nearly empty, with only a handful of other commuters scattered throughout the carriage. As I settled into my seat, I noticed a man sitting across from me, his eyes fixed on me. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, a coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the passing scenery outside the window. But no matter how hard I tried to look away, I could feel his gaze burning into me, like a predator sizing up its prey. As the train rumbled on, the man inched closer, his presence looming over me like a dark shadow. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was alone with him in the empty carriage, with no one around to help me if things took a turn for the worse. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something was seriously wrong. There was an air of menace about the man that I couldn't shake, a feeling that I was in danger. Then, without warning, he spoke. His voice was low and guttural, sending a chill down my spine. He asked me where I was going, his words dripping with malice. I tried to ignore him, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead as I prayed for the train to reach the next stop. But the man wasn't about to let me off that easily. He continued to talk, his words growing more sinister with each passing moment. He spoke of things that sent shivers down my spine, of violence and darkness lurking just beneath the surface. I felt a rising sense of panic as I realized that I was trapped, with no way out and no one to help me. I knew that I had to do something, but fear rooted me to the spot, paralyzing me with terror. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the man reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice around my wrist. I tried to pull away, but his strength was overwhelming. I screamed for help, hoping that anyone would hear me and come to my rescue. But the only response was the sound of the train rumbling on, carrying us deeper into the darkness. With no other options, I fought back with everything I had, kicking and screaming as I struggled to break free from his grasp. And then, miraculously, the train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open. I wasted no time in running as fast as I could, desperate to escape the clutches of the man who had terrorized me. I didn't stop until I was safely on the platform, surrounded by other commuters who had no idea of the horror I had just endured. As I caught my breath, I glanced back at the train, half expecting to see the man's sinister face staring back at me. But he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the subway tunnel. I knew that I had narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter, one that would haunt me for years to come. I hopped onto the night bus, eager to visit a friend. It was late, and the bus was mostly empty, except for a few other passengers scattered throughout the seats. As I settled into my seat, I noticed a man in a hooded jacket sitting in the back of the bus, his gaze fixed on me. There was something about the way he looked at me that sent a chill down my spine. His eyes were cold and calculating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching my every move. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the passing scenery outside the window. But no matter how hard I tried to look away, I could feel his eyes boring into me, like daggers piercing through my soul. As the bus rumbled on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. The man in the hooded jacket seemed to be getting closer, his presence looming over me like a dark cloud. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something was seriously wrong. There was a sense of danger in the air, a feeling that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the man stood up and began to make his way towards me. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was alone with him on the empty bus, with no one around to help me if things turned violent. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I was overreacting. But the man's gaze was like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with fear. As he got closer, I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. My heart raced as I realized that he was armed, and I was completely at his mercy. I knew that I had to get off the bus to escape before it was too late. With trembling hands, I pressed the button to signal the driver to stop, praying that he would hear me and come to my rescue. The bus screeched to a halt, and I wasted no time in jumping off and sprinting away as fast as I could. But to my horror, I realized that the man was following me, his footsteps echoing in the darkness behind me. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to put as much distance between us as possible. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was gaining on me. Then, just when I thought I couldn't run any further, a passing car pulled up beside me. Relief washed over me as I saw the driver step out, a look of concern on his face as he rushed to my aid. I told him what had happened, my words tumbling out in a rush as I struggled to catch my breath. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing with anger as he realized what had happened. Together, we called the police and reported the incident, and they arrived on the scene just in time to apprehend the man. As I watched him being led away in handcuffs, a sense of relief washed over me. On a cross-country train journey to visit my grandchildren, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The train rolled steadily through the remote countryside, passing through vast stretches of wilderness that seemed to stretch on forever. As the hours passed and the landscape changed, I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation that settled over me. The train was sparsely populated, with only a handful of other passengers scattered throughout the carriages. I settled into my seat, trying to distract myself by reading a book. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a man sitting a few seats away, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, a hunger in his eyes that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore him, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But as the journey went on, the man seemed to inch closer and closer until he was sitting right next to me. I could feel his presence looming over me like a dark cloud, suffocating me with fear. He began to ask me strange questions, probing into my personal life in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. I tried to brush him off, giving vague answers and avoiding his gaze. But he persisted, his questions growing more invasive with each passing moment. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was alone with this strange man, with no one around to help me if things took a turn for the worse. I knew that I had to get away from him, to find safety before it was too late. With trembling hands, I gathered my things and made my way to the exit, praying that the station would be close by. The man followed me, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor of the train. As the doors slid open and I stepped out onto the platform, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But to my horror, the man followed me out onto the platform, his eyes burning with malice. I knew that I had to get away from him, to find help before it was too late. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I raced through the station, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, growing closer with each passing second. But I refused to look back, knowing that I couldn't afford to let fear slow me down. Finally, I spotted a group of station attendants up ahead, their uniforms a welcome sight in the darkness. With a burst of energy, I sprinted towards them, my heart pounding in my chest as I pleaded for help. The attendants sprang into action, surrounding me and forming a barrier between me and the man who had been following me. They called the police, and within minutes, officers arrived on the scene and apprehended the man. As I watched him being led away in handcuffs, a sense of relief washed over me. I had narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter, one that could have ended much worse if not for the quick thinking of the station attendants. After a grueling night shift, I trudged wearily towards the subway station, longing for the comfort of my own bed. The platform was deserted, the only sound the distant rumble of an approaching train. As the train pulled into the station, I climbed aboard and sank into a seat near the back of the carriage. Exhaustion washed over me, and I closed my eyes, hoping to steal a few moments of rest before reaching my destination. But my sleep was short-lived. I was jolted awake by the sound of rustling nearby. Startled, I opened my eyes to see a shadowy figure hunched over, rifling through my bag. Fear gripped me as I realized that I was being robbed, right here on the subway train. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the situation, my mind racing with a million questions. I knew that I had to act fast if I wanted to protect myself and my belongings. With trembling hands, I reached out and grabbed the thief's arm, trying to pull them away from my bag. But to my horror, they turned towards me, their face obscured by the shadows. I could feel their eyes boring into me, filled with malice and intent. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was face to face with my attacker, with no one around to help me if things turned violent. I searched desperately for a way out, but the train showed no signs of stopping. I tried to reason with the thief, pleading with them to leave me alone and take whatever they wanted. But they just laughed, a cold, menacing sound that sent shivers down my spine. I knew that I had to get away from them, to find safety before it was too late. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I pushed past the thief and made my way towards the doors. As the train pulled into the next station, I wasted no time in fleeing onto the platform, desperate to put as much distance between myself and my attacker as possible. But as I stepped onto the platform, I realized with horror that the thief had followed me off the train. They stood there, watching me with an unsettling intensity, as if daring me to try and escape. I knew that I had to get help, to find someone who could protect me from this dangerous individual. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, praying that the police would arrive in time to apprehend the thief. As I waited for help to arrive, the thief continued to taunt me, their words like knives cutting through the air. I felt a rising sense of panic as I realized that I was completely at their mercy, with no way to defend myself. But just when all hope seemed lost, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Relief flooded through me as I saw a group of police officers rushing towards us, their expressions grim and determined. They wasted no time in apprehending the thief, who struggled and fought against them with surprising strength. But the officers were relentless, and within moments, they had the thief in handcuffs and were leading them away. Embarking on a solo journey through remote countryside, I found myself aboard a sleeper train, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against tracks lulling me into a sense of tranquility. The cabin was small but cozy, and I settled in, looking forward to a peaceful night's sleep. As the train chugged along, I felt a sense of solitude wash over me, surrounded by darkness and the vast expanse of wilderness outside the window. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the train and the occasional rustle of passengers in nearby cabins. But as I began to drift off to sleep, I caught snippets of a conversation drifting through the thin walls of my cabin. At first, it was just murmurs, barely audible above the noise of the train. But as I strained to listen, the words became clearer, and my blood ran cold at what I heard. The voices were low and hushed, filled with a sense of urgency and secrecy. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but phrases like "get rid of her" and "no one will ever know" sent a chill down my spine. I felt a creeping sense of dread wash over me as I realized that I had stumbled upon something sinister. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was alone on a train with people who were plotting something nefarious. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something was seriously wrong. I listened intently, straining to catch any more clues about what was happening. But the voices grew quieter, fading away until there was nothing but silence. I felt a growing sense of unease as I lay there in the darkness, my mind racing with a million questions. Who were these people? What were they planning? And most importantly, was I in danger? I knew that I had to do something, to find out more about what was happening and protect myself if necessary. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed the emergency number, hoping that the authorities could help me. But as the phone rang on the other end, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. What if I was wrong, and there was a perfectly innocent explanation for what I had heard? In the end, I decided to trust my instincts and report what I had heard. The operator listened intently as I recounted the conversation, her voice calm and reassuring as she promised to send someone to investigate. Relief washed over me as I hung up the phone, knowing that help was on the way. But the feeling was short-lived, as a sudden realization hit me like a ton of bricks. What if the people I had overheard were still on the train, and they knew that I had heard them? What if they were planning to silence me before I could tell anyone what I had heard? Panic surged through me as I realized that I was in danger, trapped on a train hurtling through the darkness with no way to escape. I knew that I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. With trembling hands, I gathered my belongings and made my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I prepared to confront whoever was behind the sinister plot. But as I stepped out into the corridor, I was met with a scene of chaos. Passengers were running back and forth, their faces filled with fear and confusion. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach as I realized that I wasn't the only one who had heard the disturbing conversation. The people behind it were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. With no other options, I made my way to the front of the train, desperate to find safety before it was too late. But as I reached the conductor's cabin, I was met with a sight that chilled me to the bone. The conductor lay slumped over in his seat, a pool of blood spreading out around him. I could hear footsteps approaching from behind, and I knew that I was in grave danger. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I turned and fled, racing through the train in search of an escape route. But no matter where I turned, I was met with locked doors and dead ends. I could hear the sound of my pursuers getting closer and closer, their voices echoing through the narrow corridors of the train. I knew that I had to find a way out, to escape before it was too late. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, I spotted a door at the end of the carriage, slightly ajar. With a burst of energy, I raced towards it, throwing it open and stepping out onto the platform. The wind whipped around me as I stumbled out into the darkness, the train hurtling away into the distance. But I didn't stop running, knowing that my life depended on it. As I fled into the night, I knew that I had escaped something evil. Standing on the crowded subway platform, I waited anxiously for my train to arrive. The station was bustling with people, the air thick with the scent of sweat and stale subway air. As I scanned the faces of my fellow commuters, my gaze lingered on a man standing across the platform. He was staring at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine, his eyes burning into mine with an unsettling ferocity. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that washed over me, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The man continued to stare at me, his gaze unrelenting as he leaned against the wall, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his lips. I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach as I realized that he wasn't just looking at me, he was studying me, sizing me up like prey. I tried to look away, to focus on something else, anything else. But no matter where I turned, his eyes followed me, pouring into me with a relentless intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt a growing sense of panic welling up inside me as I realized that I was completely alone on the platform, with no one around to help me if things took a turn for the worse. I knew that I had to get away from him, to find safety before it was too late. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for someone to answer on the other end. But as the line rang and rang, my hopes began to fade. I knew that I couldn't wait any longer, that I had to get away from the man who was staring at me with such malicious intent. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and pushed my way through the crowd, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still feel his eyes on me, burning into me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I felt like prey being hunted by a predator, with nowhere to hide and no one to help me. As I reached the edge of the platform, I felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over me, my legs trembling beneath me as I struggled to keep my balance. I knew that I had to get away from the man, to find safety before it was too late. With a final burst of energy, I stumbled onto the train just as the doors slid shut behind me, the sound of my own ragged breath echoing in my ears. I collapsed into a seat, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to catch my breath. But even as the train pulled away from the station, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the air. I knew that I had narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter, one that could have ended much worse if not for my quick thinking. Taking the commuter ferry to my night shift at the hospital, I settled into a seat near the window, the rhythmic hum of the engine lulling me into a sense of calm. The ferry was crowded with commuters, each lost in their own thoughts as we made our way across the choppy waters. But as I glanced around the cabin, my heart skipped a beat when I spotted him. My ex-boyfriend was sitting a few rows behind me, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt a surge of fear wash over me as I realized that he was following me, watching my every move with a chilling determination. I tried to ignore him, to focus on the gentle rocking of the boat as we sailed through the night. But no matter where I turned, I could feel his eyes on me, pouring into me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. Memories of our tumultuous relationship flooded back to me, the arguments and the fights that had driven us apart. I knew that he was capable of violence, that he had a temper that could flare up at any moment. As the ferry continued on its journey, the tension in the cabin grew thicker and thicker, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I tried to shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. I knew that I had to do something, to find a way to protect myself from my ex-boyfriend's relentless pursuit. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for someone to answer on the other end. But as the line rang and rang, my hopes began to fade. I realized with growing dread that I was on my own, with no one to help me if things took a turn for the worse. Desperation surged through me as I searched for a way out, my mind racing with a million questions. Should I confront him? Should I try to hide? Should I jump overboard and swim to safety? But before I could make a decision, the ferry lurched suddenly, throwing me off balance and sending me sprawling to the floor. Panic surged through me as I struggled to get back on my feet, the chaos of the moment overwhelming me. As I looked up, I saw my ex-boyfriend standing over me, his eyes filled with rage. I knew that I was in serious danger, that he would stop at nothing to hurt me. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I scrambled to my feet and pushed past him, desperate to escape before it was too late. But as I reached the door, I realized with horror that it was locked, trapping me inside with my attacker. I could feel his hot breath on the back of my neck as he reached out to grab me, his fingers closing around my arm with a vice-like grip. I screamed for help, but my cries were drowned out by the sound of the wind and the crashing waves. In that moment, I knew that I was fighting for my life, that I had to do whatever it took to survive. With every ounce of strength I had left, I fought back against my attacker, striking out with all the force I could muster. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Relief flooded through me as I saw a group of passengers rushing towards us, their faces grim and determined. With their help, I was able to break free from my attacker's grasp and escape to safety. After a grueling day at work, I found myself catching a late-night tram home. The cabin was nearly empty, the only other passengers scattered throughout the car, lost in their own thoughts. I settled into a seat near the back, hoping to relax and unwind during the journey. As the tram rattled through the deserted streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A sense of unease settled over me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I glanced around the cabin. With every passing stop, my heart pounded harder in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was following me, their eyes burning into the back of my skull. I tried to brush off the feeling, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the air. As the tram rumbled on, the sense of unease only grew stronger, the darkness outside pressing in on me from all sides. I felt like a trapped animal, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to for help. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to explain the situation to the operator on the other end. But as the tram rattled on, the line went dead, leaving me alone in the darkness with my fear. I knew that I had to do something, to find a way to protect myself from whatever was out there. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I made my way to the front of the tram, determined to confront whoever was following me. But as I reached the conductor's cabin, I froze in horror at what I saw. The conductor lay slumped over in his seat, blood pooling beneath him on the floor. I could hear footsteps approaching from behind, and I knew that I was in grave danger. With no other options, I turned and fled, racing through the tram in search of an escape route. But no matter where I turned, I was met with locked doors and dead ends. I could hear the sound of my pursuer getting closer and closer, their footsteps echoing through the narrow corridors of the tram. I knew that I had to find a way out, to escape before it was too late. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, I spotted a door at the end of the carriage, slightly ajar. With a burst of energy, I raced towards it, throwing it open and stepping out onto the deserted street. The cold night air hit me like a punch to the chest, but I didn't stop running, knowing that my life depended on it. As I fled into the darkness, I could hear my pursuer hot on my heels, their ragged breath echoing in my ears. But despite my fear, I refused to give up hope. I knew that I had to keep running, to keep fighting, until I found safety or until my last breath. I managed to get away with my life, but I have not been the same since. After a night out with my friends, I boarded a crowded bus to head home. The atmosphere inside was tense, with people chatting quietly amongst themselves as the bus wound its way through the deserted streets. I settled into a seat near the back, feeling tired but content after a fun evening. But as I glanced out the window, I noticed a group of boys standing on the corner, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. They were whispering amongst themselves, casting furtive glances in my direction as if they were planning something. My heart began to race as I realized that I was being watched, that these boys were up to no good. I tried to brush off the feeling of unease, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something was seriously wrong. As the bus continued on its journey, the sense of dread only grew stronger, the silence inside the cabin becoming suffocating. I could feel the eyes of the boys burning into me, their presence looming over me like a dark shadow. With every passing moment, I felt like I was walking into a trap, like I was being led into a dangerous situation with no way out. I knew that I had to do something, to find a way to protect myself from whatever these boys had planned. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I tried to explain the situation to the operator on the other end. But as the line rang and rang, my hopes began to fade. I realized with growing dread that I was on my own, with no one to help me if things took a turn for the worse. Desperation surged through me as I searched for a way out, my mind racing with a million questions. Should I confront the boys? Should I try to hide? Should I get off the bus and run for help? But before I could make a decision, the bus lurched suddenly, throwing me off balance and sending me stumbling into the aisle. Panic surged through me as I struggled to regain my footing, the chaos of the moment overwhelming me. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, the bus screeched to a halt at my stop, the doors sliding open with a hiss. With a surge of adrenaline, I bolted from my seat and raced off the bus, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran for safety. As I reached the safety of my home, I realized how lucky I was. I was working my usual night shift as a bus driver, cruising through the empty streets of the city. It was quiet, almost eerie, with only the dim glow of streetlights illuminating the darkness. I was used to the solitude of the late-night hours, but something felt off that night. As I made my rounds, I noticed two figures standing at the deserted bus stop up ahead. They looked like they were waiting for a ride, but there was something about them that sent a shiver down my spine. Maybe it was the way they stood perfectly still, or the fact that they were wearing dark hoodies pulled up over their faces, obscuring their features. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should stop and pick them up. But then I remembered my duty as a bus driver, to provide transportation to anyone who needed it, no questions asked. So, I pulled over and opened the doors, motioning for them to come aboard. They climbed onto the bus without saying a word, their movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't see their faces beneath the hoods, and it made me uneasy. But I tried to brush it off and focus on driving. As we continued down the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The two men sat in silence, staring straight ahead, their hands tucked into the pockets of their hoodies. It was unnerving, like they were plotting something sinister. I tried to ignore them and concentrate on the road, but my nerves were on edge. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of them whispering to each other, their voices low and menacing. I started to regret picking them up, wishing I had trusted my instincts and kept driving. But it was too late now, and I had to focus on getting them to their destination safely. Suddenly, one of the men stood up from his seat and started walking towards the front of the bus. My heart raced as I watched him approach, unsure of what he was planning to do. He stopped in front of me and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small knife. My blood ran cold as he brandished it in front of my face, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Keep driving," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "And don't try anything stupid." I nodded, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I obeyed his commands. The other man stayed in his seat, watching me with cold, calculating eyes. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, the tension thick in the air. I didn't dare to speak or even look at them, afraid of what they might do if I provoked them. Finally, we reached their stop, and they ordered me to pull over. I did as they asked, relieved that the ordeal was finally over. But as they stepped off the bus, the man with the knife turned to me and grinned, his teeth glinting in the darkness. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "And remember, we know where you work." With that, they disappeared into the night, leaving me shaken and terrified. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I would never forget the chilling encounter on that lonely night shift. I was a backpacker, eager to explore hidden gems off the beaten path. One night, I boarded a remote train, hoping to discover new adventures. As the train chugged through the darkness, I settled into my seat, excitement coursing through my veins. But as the hours passed and the train rattled on, a sense of unease crept over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, their eyes lingering in the shadows. I tried to brush off my fears, chalking it up to nerves or imagination. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. I glanced around the dimly lit carriage, but there was no one nearby. Just the rhythmic sound of the train wheels against the tracks, echoing through the empty cabin. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I was alone, isolated in the middle of nowhere with no one to turn to for help. The thought sent a wave of panic coursing through me, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to focus on the passing scenery outside the window, but my gaze kept drifting back to the darkness of the carriage. It felt like there were eyes watching me, unseen and unrelenting. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ward off the chill that had settled in my bones. But no matter how hard I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, it clung to me like a shadow. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop, jolting me out of my thoughts. I peered out the window, but all I could see was darkness stretching out into infinity. I glanced around the carriage, but there was still no one in sight. Just me and the oppressive silence of the night. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry with fear, as I realized I had no idea where I was or how far I was from civilization. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to think rationally. I reached for my backpack, searching for my phone to call for help. But as I fumbled with the buttons, I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no signal. I cursed under my breath, frustration and fear bubbling up inside me. I was completely alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to escape. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, as I listened for any sound that might indicate help was on the way. But all I could hear was the eerie silence of the night, broken only by the distant hum of the train engine. I knew I had to do something, anything, to get out of this situation. But as I peered into the darkness outside the window, a sense of dread washed over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I huddled in my seat, my heart pounding in my chest, as I waited for dawn to break and the nightmare to end. But deep down, I knew that the darkness held secrets far more terrifying than I could ever imagine. I was a night shift worker, heading to my job at the airport terminal. It was late, and the streets were empty as I waited for the shuttle to arrive. When it finally pulled up, I climbed aboard, grateful for the warmth of the interior. As the shuttle sped through the deserted highways, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The darkness outside seemed to press in on me, suffocating and oppressive. I tried to brush off my unease, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the minutes ticked by, my nerves only grew more frayed. I glanced around the shuttle, but there was no one else on board except for the driver. He seemed focused on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I tried to strike up a conversation with him, hoping to ease my growing sense of unease. But he just grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the road. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the darkness outside for signs of danger. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every noise sending a jolt of fear through my body. I cursed myself for being so paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Suddenly, the shuttle swerved sharply to the side, jolting me out of my thoughts. I grabbed onto the seat in front of me, my heart racing as the driver struggled to regain control. I looked out the window, expecting to see a car or obstacle in the road. But to my horror, there was nothing there. Just empty highway stretching out into the darkness. I turned to the driver, but he didn't seem fazed by the sudden swerve. He just kept driving, his expression unreadable. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that something was seriously wrong. But before I could say anything, the driver spoke, his voice low and ominous. "We're almost there," he said, his words sending a shiver down my spine. I nodded, too scared to argue, as the shuttle continued on its journey. But as we neared the airport terminal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. As the shuttle pulled up to the terminal, I scrambled to get off, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere inside. But as I stepped out into the cold night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around nervously, but there was no one else in sight except for the driver, who was already pulling away from the curb. I shivered, feeling exposed and vulnerable in the darkness. But as I hurried towards the terminal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped a brush with something far more sinister. I was a college student, heading home after a late-night study session at the library. The train station was deserted as I waited for the last train to arrive. When it finally pulled up, I hurried aboard, eager to get home and collapse into bed. The train was almost empty, with only a few other passengers scattered throughout the carriage. I found a seat near the back and settled in, feeling grateful for the chance to relax after a long day of classes and studying. As the train rumbled down the tracks, I felt my eyelids growing heavy with fatigue. I tried to fight off sleep, but it was no use. Before I knew it, I had drifted off into a deep slumber. I awoke to the sound of silence, disoriented and confused. It took me a moment to remember where I was, and when I opened my eyes, I realized that I was alone in the carriage. Panic gripped me as I realized that I must have missed my stop. I glanced around frantically, searching for any sign of the other passengers, but they were nowhere to be seen. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to calm myself down. I told myself that I must have just slept through my stop and that I would be able to get off at the next one. But as I peered into the darkness outside the window, a sense of dread washed over me. The train seemed to be moving faster than usual, hurtling through the night with an eerie sense of purpose. I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but my hands were shaking too violently to hold it steady. I cursed under my breath, feeling utterly helpless and alone. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure was lurking in the shadows at the far end of the carriage, watching me with cold, calculating eyes. My blood ran cold as I realized that I wasn't alone after all. I tried to convince myself that it was just another passenger who had stayed on the train past their stop, but something about the way they were staring at me sent a shiver down my spine. I forced myself to look away, pretending not to notice the figure in the shadows. but out of the corner of my eye, I could see them moving closer, their footsteps echoing ominously in the empty carriage. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest as I realized that I was trapped, with no way to escape. I considered running to the other end of the carriage, but something told me that would only make things worse. Instead, I pressed myself against the window, hoping that if I made myself as small as possible, the figure wouldn't notice me. But it was no use. They were getting closer with each passing moment, their presence looming over me like a dark cloud. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the train to stop and for someone to come to my rescue. But deep down, I knew that I was on my own, with no one to help me but myself. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy against my skin. I recoiled in horror, my heart racing as I realized that the figure had reached me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak as the figure leaned in close, their breath hot against my neck. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. I opened my eyes to find myself alone in the carriage once more, the only evidence of their presence the lingering feeling of dread that hung in the air. I stumbled off the train at the next stop, my legs shaking with exhaustion and terror.